Hello, and welcome to Drugs, Death and Hypocrisy. My name's Marianne Seacart. Alcohol and tobacco are the drugs of choice for much of the Western world, yet they're remarkably deadly. The WHO estimates that tobacco alone kills 8 million people a year. Now that's more than the number that have died from COVID in the past year. Yet at the same time, Western nations have carried out a war on the recreational drugs of other countries, such as cocaine, cannabis, and heroin, for half a century, sometimes with boots on the ground, more often with legal and economic barriers. So should we end this hypocrisy by recognizing the dangers of alcohol and tobacco and ceasing to export them to other nations, or more radically, perhaps, by making them illegal? Or should we accept that the policy is economically unjust and irrational and allow trade in recreational drugs of whatever type and from whatever nation? Well, we've got a fantastic panel to discuss this today. David Nutt, I'm sure you've all heard of, is an esteemed neuropsychopharmacologist and former drug czar. He's a leading authority on drugs and alcohol, who was actually sacked from being drug czar for saying quite accurately that taking ecstasy is less dangerous than riding a horse. He also says the safe limit of alcohol would be 1 glass of wine a year. So my evening's ruined then. Deirdre McCloskey is Distinguished Professor Emerita of Economics, History, English and Communication at the University of Illinois. She's a renowned libertarian economist and writer, and she describes herself as a postmodern, free market, quantitative, Episcopalian, feminist, Aristotelian. And Peter Sjöstedt is a rising star of psychedelic philosophy, known as the psychedelic Nietzsche. He's a research fellow at the University of Exeter, the author of Numernautics, and I think this caps it all, he's the inspiration for a Marvel superhero, Karnak. So the question is the West hypocritical in its treatment of drugs, alcohol and tobacco? And if so, what should be done to end the hypocrisy? David Nutt, I'm going to start with you.
One of the things I like to do when I'm talking to undergraduates, I'm a professor at Imperial College London, and I ask them, how was this great university funded? And they say, oh, I don't know, railways, coal. And I say, no, selling opium to the Chinese and selling cannabis to the Indians. And they, because of course people forget that the British Empire was the largest drug dealer that was ever known. Sure. But now, as a result of political changes and international pressure, particularly in the USA, the drugs we used to make our money from are now illegal, and we prosecute people for using them. Whereas we celebrate the access to drugs like alcohol and tobacco, largely because those businesses have become rather sophisticated in manipulating our politicians. So as you intimated at the beginning, I've researched and given governments advice about drugs for quite a few years, and telling the truth to governments about the comparative harms of drugs is a rather fruitless exercise, because governments don't want to know. And the fact they don't want to know proves that the policies are hypocritical, dishonest, not evidence-based, and should be dramatically overhauled, both nationally and internationally.
Thank you. Deirdre McCloskey.
Well, I have, as an economist, as a Chicago school economist in some ways, I'm very empathetic with the idea of treating people as adults, as against sad or bad children. And so my own view of this is, yes, of course, the West and the East and the North and the South are hypocritical. Humans are. and on that score, I think that we should abolish all the drug laws on alcohol, on tobacco, and on anything else you you think you would enjoy ingesting. I don't think there's any political philosophical case for extra taxation on alcohol or prohibition of marijuana or whatever on the grounds of, oh, it hurts you. I don't exercise enough. Does that mean that the government should rouse me at 6 o'clock in the morning and bring us all out for group exercise. So if we're going to follow the great principle of John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith, I always cross myself when I mention Adam Smith. I'm an Anglican, so this is a serious matter. We should treat people as grown-ups, not as children.
So, Peter.
Well, yes, I suppose to answer your question, I do think it's hypocritical, or rather it's sort of irrational and unscientific, the prohibition of certain drugs as opposed to certain others. I think the reason for the prohibition of certain drugs is mostly, well, it can be traced historically. If you look, for example, at the conquistadors, those who colonized the Americas, you see that the relation, the approach they had to peyote and psilocybin in the magic mushrooms there was one of suppression due to a Christian general framework or Roman Catholic framework. It was said by a number of Jesuits there that such drugs would give you access to the devil and that they were harmful. There were some actually who talked about the medicinal value and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, we see the prohibition starting there. Later on, Puritans coming to Northern America had their own reasons for prohibition, but also, of course, alcohol. Alcohol was banned in America in the early 20th century, as we all know, didn't work out, but gave rise to cocktails, I believe, and so on. And then as we go into the sort of early 19th and early 20th centuries, we see that at least psychedelics, the drugs that I'm mostly interested in, they were really confined to the intellectual and artistic sphere, with Baudelaire and then people like William James, the great American philosopher William James, who spoke about alcohol as the first level of mystical consciousness, even going on to ether, nitrous oxide, and so on and so forth. And then I should mention before that the great Cornishman Humphrey Davy, who lived around here in Penzance, who tried nitrous oxide and related it to philosophy, idealism, Spinozism, and so on. So there was this intellectual precedent of psychoactive drugs, at least in Britain, but then you had the sort of legacy of certain religious frameworks that caused prohibition, and then Timothy Leary caused a bit of a sort of commotion in America, which then got transmuted to the whole world. And but alcohol, tobacco, and a few other drugs, they were maintained as legal. And now, as David Nutt actually has shown with empirical evidence, these drugs are actually more harmful than many of the psychedelic drugs, which are Class A or scheduled here. So the science no longer maps onto the law. The logic based on history doesn't map on to the law. And then also, I would say that do see drugs as criminal or recreational. This is a product of the mid-20th century. We can see them as medicinal, as LSD originally was intended to be, but also as intellectual and philosophical, metaphysical. It has metaphysical sort of values as well. So one hopes that the law will change to match reason and science. But I would also say this, there are a lot of other ethical considerations. For example, if you immediately legalized all drugs, you get into other problems. For example, scarcity of certain cacti, toads, and so on. So it's actually, it's not a black and white issue. It has to be carefully done.
Have the West's economic interests been central to its attitude to other nations' recreational drugs? Is it all about economics? Is it all about the alcohol and tobacco industries, do you think? Deirdre?
I don't think so. It's certainly true that the opium wars were. They were economic in character and absurd obsession with the balance of trade among India and China and Britain. But for modern prohibition, I think we have to point to my own country And it's on again, off again, puritanical obsessions. I mean, my country, like yours, is a free country, but every once in a while, we want to get the state in there and force people to do things. And what's odd about the history of drug prohibition is that it starts in the United States, cocaine against African Americans in the early 20th century, marijuana prohibition against Hispanic Americans. And then, of course, we try the noble experiment of alcohol prohibition, which, as has been pointed out, was a catastrophe. And then in the 1930s, one particular guy, I forget his name, said, that's right, we have to do this for drugs. Politically, people like prohibition. Individually, they hate it.
Yeah, so David, do you think it's all about puritanism, or do you think it's about the economic interests of perhaps the alcohol and tobacco industry?
It started, well, yes, it's complicated.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.